So the Great Depression is on, and the president at the time, another Republican, Herbert Hoover, is basically saying what professional economists, what the consensus viewpoint was at the time. Leave it alone, laissez-faire, the economy will self-adjust, you will only make things worse if you intervene. And recovery just didn't happen. Team Keynes points to the fact that a decimated financial sector contributed to the lack of animal spirits. People just weren't spending. People weren't doing the productive things necessary to have self-correction happen. Recall we've already talked about how Keynes saw that it wasn't working and came up with new ideas on what needs to happen during depressions. Things like sticky wages and sticky prices, where prices aren't as likely to change as needed because it's hard sometimes to change prices. It's one of the important self-adjustment mechanisms that was kind of broken at the time. You've probably heard of the New Deal and federal works programs. They are featured in a lot of history classes, if you've taken a history class on this. A lot of poverty assistance to people who are poor enough to qualify. They get money to help pay their bills. Part of the New Deal was Social Security to make sure that older people who can't work anymore don't suffer from poverty. They still have some income. Those were all born during the 1930s. Federal works programs involved jobs that the government would provide to do just about anything, just to kind of give at least some people a job. And all of this was supposed to stimulate the economy out of its doldrums. The problem is FDR, if you go back to that slide on the top tax rate, the history of it, which I uploaded onto D2L, so you can look at it at any time, it shows quite a few and massive tax increases during the FDR administration. There's a sense outside of the economic spectrum, economic field, that the political spectrum is defined by liberals who credit FDR and the New Deal for ending the Great Depression and conservatives who say it was World War II. Among economists, the liberal economists actually say it was World War II. They'll give FDR brownie points for trying, but Keynes himself very publicly criticized FDR for his tax increases. You don't raise taxes during recessions and depressions. You leave that for economic growth periods. You leave them low and you borrow and you don't worry about deficits. Just spend your way out of the depression without taxing. FDR did the spending part, but he undermined himself with the taxing part, according to Team Keynes. The World War II argument is actually a very Keynesian argument, which is why more Hayek-oriented economists don't like it. FDR was a politically sensitive person. He didn't want deficits, but World War II gave him the excuse he needed to not raise taxes and borrow heavily while spending at the massive levels needed to jolt the economy out of its doldrums, to get those animal spirits going up again. The refrain in the Keynes versus Hayek battle rap is to blame low interest rates. Nah, it's the animal spirits. The animal spirits refer basically to consumer confidence and business confidence and investor confidence. If you're not confident in the economy, you're going to save your money, and we have the paradox of thrift. You're not going to invest your money, you're going to put it into lower risk, lower yield investments, and you don't have the investments that are needed to boost the economy up. So the animal spirits basically refer to that sort of thing, and World War II is what finally allowed for the kind of spending necessary to get that going. Team Hayek, however, says that, again, blaming laissez-faire doesn't work because Hoover talked the talk of laissez-faire, but he didn't walk the walk of laissez-faire. He raised taxes by a bunch. You see that on the top tax rate history slide. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs are a very now infamous act that was put into law that put a lot of tariffs on imported goods in general that incited other countries to do the same, kicked off trade wars, and really shut down international trade during a time when the United States really depended on international trade. And FDR or Hoover also had a federal works program that he just didn't market the way FDR did. FDR was much better at the marketing aspect of politics than Hoover was. So Hoover did a lot of intervening in the economy that Hayek types say doesn't work. Even the Federal Works Program thing, it diverts resources away from whatever the market is saying it needs resources to be doing to help it grow. Federal Works programs just take a lot of labor that could go into other things and repurposes them. Meanwhile, poverty assistance, there's no productivity to base it on. Remember, money gets its value as a medium of exchange. There has to be value on both sides of each coin, literal and figurative. What poverty assistance programs do is it gives money without value being on both sides. There is actually some public choice theory to say that with a population that wants poverty assistance, there is value on both sides, which is why a lot of the inflation that more Team Hayek-oriented economists will worry about doesn't always happen. But either way, you still ultimately need there to be some growth on the productive side, and Hayek types argued that the New Deal and Federal Works programs just increased problems getting in the way of growth for these reasons. There were efforts to support the agricultural communities because those are deemed necessary things, and you want farmers to do well. So to make sure farmers did well, that's where a lot of subsidies that still exist today to support farmers were invented and implemented. And because prices need to be high for farmers to make money, to support those prices, the federal government basically ordered a lot of farmers to destroy surplus food at a time when people were starving. So all of this is very anti-laissez-faire stuff that Hayek types will point to as things that got in the way of recovery, in addition to the tax increases. World War II didn't get it done either, according to Team Hayek. Unemployment went away, sure, but living conditions were still bad. People still couldn't buy anything with what little income they had, no more than they could during the 1930s. So all you really had was low unemployment because people who could work were going off to fight the war. It wasn't until after the war ended, the Truman administration, though he was a Democrat and took office as FDR's vice president at the time of FDR's death, actually rolled back a lot of FDR's policies, namely some of the high taxes. That, combined with a lot of the technology that had been developed during the Great Depression but couldn't really go to market, a lot of production could finally start on that as a lot of sort of hostile to business things were undone by Truman. It really allowed for an economic boom that characterized especially the 1950s, one of the most prosperous times in the country's history. In a lot of respects, it's a favored period of economic growth for a lot of economists, left and right. Unemployment was at full employment for pretty much the entire decade. Growth was terrific. Incomes were rising from top to bottom, and they were rising in a very equitable manner, as Team Keynes often will point out. And they'll point to the fact that the workforce was more heavily unionized than it is today, which is one of the big reasons, along with the 91% top tax rate, that you could have so much growth without growth and inequality. And then the National Highway Project is also pointed to as an example of a sort of Keynesian way of really boosting economic growth. It's a lot of government spending that would have to lead to a lot of growth. And then at the end of the 50s, a recession was kind of starting because business cycles happen and recessions will happen, but you had Democrat presidents, JFK and then Lyndon Johnson through 68. The recession was short-lived, and you had more of the same type of growth that you had throughout the 50s. Culminating the Great Society programs were basically where we got Medicare and Medicaid that expanded access to health insurance to a lot of people who, for various reasons, due to income as far as Medicaid is concerned and lack of insurability as senior citizens are concerned, as you have more health problems, those problems were dealt with Great Society programs. Hayek types will look at Eisenhower and they'll say he was more anti-union than anybody previous. He's more there was more union activity than today, sure, But that's not the proper comparison. It was harder to be in a union in the 50s than it was with FDR as president, for sure. And it was a more manufacturer-heavy economy in the 50s than today. It's easier to have unions for the type of work that was done in the 50s than today. And the top tax rate had been cut down to 91% by the Truman administration and stayed pretty much at that level throughout the 50s. So saying that we can raise it from where it is now to 91%, according to Team Hayek, is not going to recreate the 50s. It's actually going to recreate something more like in the 30s when that sort of thing happened and we had the Great Depression. And when it comes to public spending, Team Hayek isn't against the government spending money on things that we're not going to get without the federal government spending money on it, like the National Highway Project. It was non-wasteful. It was something that got done relatively quickly for such a large government project, given what we're used to now. And it was very beneficial for businesses who could now trade much more easily within the country. So it's maybe kind of a good blending of Keynesian and anti-Keynesian ways of doing things. You can find public projects like that to do, then economists across the spectrum will pretty much agree that, yeah, definitely do it. As far as Democrats in the presidency in the 60s, Kennedy, a lot of Hayek types will point out today, would be considered a conservative. He was very pro-capitalism. He wasn't too opposed to our intervention in Vietnam because he wanted to stop the spread of communism. He was on record as having said so. And there are some indications that he was even supportive of Joseph McCarthy during the McCarthy witch hunts, trying to root communists. I mean, Kennedy was very, very against communism and very, very supportive of capitalism. And you look at that chart of the top tax rates, he had a huge cut to the top tax rate, and that really it's credited by Hayek types as staving off the recession that started in the 60s and helping to usher in another decade of economic growth. The Great Society programs were implemented, deficits rose, and they are blamed for some of the inflation by Hayek types that we saw in the 70s. 70s, we've already talked about oil shocks, especially if you took my micro classes. OPEC was getting back at countries that supported Iran during the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices went through the roof, and they were basically responding to Nixon's foreign policy. Nixon was a Republican president, and 20-plus years of economic prosperity down the tubes as soon as Nixon took over. A lot of Hayek types will say that the 70s should have killed Keynesianism because you had stagflation, high inflation, and high unemployment. We've talked about the Phillips curve and how there's usually a trade-off. Team Keynes types will point out that the Phillips curve doesn't talk about cost-push inflation. It talks about demand-pull inflation more than anything else. So maybe a little incorrect to say that it should have killed Keynesian ideas. Team Hayek points out that Nixon was a very left-of-center president when it came to economic policy, ending the gold standard, coining the phrase, "we are all Keynesians now." From the battle rap, "say it loud and say it proud, we're all Keynesians now." That came from the Nixon administration. He established the EPA. A lot of regulations coming down from there. And, of course, he was responsible for price controls that helped to give us really long gas lines and exacerbate the problems. At the end of the 70s, there was a savings and loan crisis. Savings and loans tried to be a little less profitable, a little more non-profit, a little more George Bailey, a little less Old Man Potter. Not a very good business model for banks, essentially, is how savings and loans would operate. They're much more prone to problems associated with, say, high interest rates that prevailed as a result of the inflation in the 70s. And it was deregulating that was done actually by Jimmy Carter that is credited by Hayek types for helping to end the savings and loan crisis, or at least help it to not become as big of a problem for the economy as financial crises often are.